This video is made possible by donations to the United States Lighthouse Society from people like you. Welcome everybody on behalf of the U.S. Lighthouse Society. Welcome to another virtual event. I know a lot of you have attended a number of these over the last couple of years or so. We did one recently, just a few weeks ago, about Ida Lewis, the famous lighthouse keeper in Rhode Island. And today's event is about another extremely interesting woman lighthouse keeper, but this time on the West Coast in Santa Cruz, as we were just saying. And I'm going to introduce our presenter in just a couple of minutes. For people who might not know, I'm Jeremy D'Entremont. I'm the historian for the U.S. Lighthouse Society. I host the weekly podcast for the Society, Lighthearted. Also with us today is Jeff Gales, Executive Director of the U.S. Lighthouse Society. Hi, Jeff.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. Thanks, Jeremy, for doing this on a Saturday.
You're welcome. Glad you could be here. And Jeff will be taking part in a while, especially when we get to the Q&A portion of our event today. Speaking about the podcast, by the way, I want to mention that the episode that will be posted tomorrow, the new episodes are always posted on Sunday. Tomorrow's episode will be about Ida Lewis, and it'll be the same two guests that were in our Zoom event a few weeks ago, Lenore Scommel, the author of the book on Ida Lewis, and Nico Reno, a movie director who is working to get a movie produced all about Ida Lewis. So if you want to hear more about all that, check the podcast episode being posted tomorrow. You can hear the podcast on your smartphone with any podcast app. The title is Lighthearted, 2 words. Just search for Lighthearted. Or you can go to the Society's news blog at news.uslhs.org to listen to it. Again, news.uslhs.org. Again, I am going to ask that people mute your mics. And actually, Lynn, I'm going to introduce you in a moment, but for this moment, you might want to mute your mic until you speak, but that's good. All right, thank you. So another thing I want to mention before we get underway here is the tours, the domestic international tours U.S. Lighthouse Society does. You can go to uslhs.org, click on tours to get all the details about those. A couple of this year's international tours, the one to Iceland and one to Spain, are already completely booked. They're all full, but there's room in the other international tours and the domestic tours. I'll be leading a tour to Long Island, New York, May 13th to 20th. You can still sign up for that. And I know there's some people here today who are going on that tour. I'm very much looking forward to it. So again, just go to uslhs.org to learn more about all that. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our presenter for today, Lynn Guenther. Lynn has written a fascinating new book, and here it is, Light of the Bay, about Laura Hecox. Really interesting personality. First, I want to give you a little background on who Laura Hecox was. Again, it's Hecox for people who might not know, Laura Hecox. She was a pioneer, naturalist, collector, activist, lighthouse keeper, museum benefactor. Few people accomplished more in their lifetimes or meant more to the history of Santa Cruz, California than Laura Hecox. In 1869, Adna Hecox was appointed keeper of the lighthouse at Santa Cruz, California. And in 1883, Adna died and his daughter Laura became keeper. She got the appointment from the federal government. She stayed on her post for 33 years and had quite an interesting career, which we're going to hear about today. Lynn Guenther's historical novel, Light of the Bay, tells the remarkable story of Laura Hecox from a first-person perspective. As she prepares to retire after her many years as a keeper at Santa Cruz, she looks back on her life. Through Laura's eyes, readers travel across the country by wagon train, witness the growth of Santa Cruz following California statehood, develop a passion for scientific inquiry, meet an array of colorful historic figures, and fall in love. So what more could you want? I just want to mention too, while I'm thinking of it, the lighthouse where Laura was the keeper at Santa Cruz no longer stands. There is a lighthouse close by there. I think Lynn may touch on this in a while, but there is a lighthouse close by there that is more modern and is actually a surfing museum. It's also known as the Mark Abbott Memorial Lighthouse. But that is not the same lighthouse where Laura was the keeper. So our speaker today, Lynn Guenther, serves her community as a member of organizations fostering art, ecology, and education. Her passion for teaching inspired her novel, Light of the Bay. She's also an artist and jeweler, and her jewelry is really beautiful. If you're interested in that, check out Lynn's website at lynnguenther.com. I'll post it in the chat in a moment. I'll post the link in the chat. It's spelled LYNN GUENTHER.com, lauraguenther.com. But again, I'll post that in the chat. So I'm going to turn it over to Lynn in a moment. I also want to mention that when Lynn finishes her presentation, I'm going to play a short video that was recorded yesterday with Kathleen Aston, who is the collections manager for the Santa Cruz Museum of Natural History, home to the Laura Hecox collection. She's going to tell us about that. That's about 8 or 9 minutes. And after we see that, we'll open it up for Q&A. You can enter your questions in the chat as things go along, or you can virtually raise your hand and we'll call on you when we get to the Q&A portion. So at this point, Lynn, I'm going to turn it over to you. The floor is yours. Lynn, you can go ahead and unmute your mic. And when you're ready, you can go ahead and share your screen. So. Okay, Lynn, you can click on your mic icon there to unmute yourself.
All right. So thanks a lot, Jeremy. I appreciate it. And yeah, one thing that makes me a little bit less nervous addressing all of you. Good afternoon and happy Women's History Month to everybody. But it's the fact that we're all very interested in lighthouses enough to take time out of our Saturday and come together and learn a little bit about a lighthouse keeper and a woman lighthouse keeper at that. And it always kind of interests me that people who are attracted to lighthouse are sort of artistic, poetic, you know, that beacon in the tempest-tossed sea for the mariners, and it kind of brings out that spirit of the naturalist in us and the mariners and the adventurous spirit that we have. So it's kind of exciting to be addressing this particular group of people. So thanks for tuning in and letting me share my passion about Laura Hecox with you. I grew up in Michigan, and so I've always been interested in lighthouses and fascinated by them. And living in Santa Cruz was kind of exciting. I live out here near the lighthouse, Santa Cruz, Point Santa Cruz, and we don't have the old lighthouse, but we do have, you know, the location where the lighthouse is. So there's still a lot for the imagination to kind of imagine life when the harbor was full of ships from all over the world. And so this is a picture of Laura, and she is collecting specimens out here in the rocks right now. And I'm trying to advance, Jeremy, but I'm not able to do that. I guess I can do it here at this area. Okay, so anyways, this is my book here. I had kind of written the book with a younger audience in mind because I've been teaching art and science to local students for many, many years. And but this other book over here to the right-hand side is a book by Frank Perry. And that really inspired me to write about Laura Hecox, to use her as my role model for teaching about the Santa Cruz history, about our watershed, about our natural history and our cultural history, which is part of watershed education. So Frank's book, I highly recommend if you are interested in Santa Cruz's lighthouse history here. And it's where I got a lot of my information. And Frank really did help me a lot with pulling together information that he didn't have in his book, but he helped me do some of the research. And so I really appreciate his help on this. And this is a picture by Edward Muybridge. And he was commissioned, he was a very famous photographer, that, for those of you who don't know, he was commissioned back in 1874 to take a picture of each of the lighthouses along the California coast. It's not a very high quality picture, unfortunately, but you can kind of see here this natural bridge, and this has really changed. And this is the old lighthouse. And I really love this picture just because it has such a, the lighthouse looks so spectacular out there, and it really shows the drama of the cliffs and the waves. And but I'll show you what it actually looks like nowadays. So that big natural bridge was right here. And so this is all that's left. So we live on a coast that is, you know, basically marine sediment. It's kind of shaped in these terraces, and you know, sandstone, very, very easily eroded. So you can see how quickly this has only been, you know, not even a couple hundred years, and it's drastically eroded. And you can see over here the riprap. They really try to kind of preserve the coast as much as possible, but that only holds up for so long. And after this winter, we've really had a lot of erosion. So just in the past, you know, few months, we've seen quite a bit of changes along our coastline, which is, you know, it's always moving. It's an extremely dynamic, you know, landscape. So the way I begin my whole story is sort of in chronological order. And I begin the story with Adna Hecox meeting his wife-to-be, Margaret Hammer. And she was a teacher in Detroit, and he was a bargeman. And she was teaching in one school classroom with students from first grade, you know, up to, you know, 18-year-olds. So she had quite a difficult job back then. And I believe he was, you know, working on the ships, and perhaps in the winter time working, you know, while the ships were docked, you know, cleaning and caring for the barges when they were not on the water. So they got married, and they moved to Illinois, and that was kind of a frontier back at that time. But Adna Hecox was a real adventurous spirit, and he, the interesting thing about their relationship is he was illiterate when they met, and Margaret Hecox taught him how to read. And she must have been quite a good teacher, because couple years after they were married, he actually got his minister's license from the Methodist Church and became a minister. And so they moved to Illinois, and he tried to establish a couple groups there, a Methodist church, and he would give sermons inside his home. And that's kind of a theme that carries out all throughout his history. He was very involved in the Methodist church, and Margaret Hecox was the main educator for their family as they, you know, moved to different places, and even her own husband. And so here, this is just kind of an engraving of that move out west, the pioneers. They sold everything they had, put it in a wagon, and you can see they started their, I don't know if you can see this map over here, but they started, you know, right at the Mississippi River, crossed that. They met up with the Emis Party, and they were following a pretty well-established path until they got to the Missouri River. And after that, after they crossed that river, that was basically the end of any established path. They were just kind of following animal tracks and, you know, the Native American paths that were there. So there was really no established path. This was back in 1846. So it was really pretty unexplored. There was just a lot of, you know, there was not many settlers out there. Was pretty much just trappers and traders, and so that was pretty much the only people that they met across the way. You can see there was some established forts like Fort Laramie, Fort Hall, and they had a lot of adventures. And I actually got a really good idea of what happened across this track because one of the Hecox family was quite large. They had 7 children that survived. No, actually 8 children. And Catherine Hecox was 5 years old when they began this trek across the country. And she became a writer later in life. And she recorded her mother's memoirs. Her mother, told her the stories. She's just transcribed these memories, and they created a book called California Caravan. So this California Caravan was very informative about the way she felt along the way. It was very interesting to have a woman's perspective during the crossing. A lot of times you hear a man's perspective, but what it was like to be a woman on this long, pioneer trail. They took the northern California, Oregon route out west, and traveled 2,000 miles. Took them about 6 months to get across the country. And along the way, probably in about, I think, Fort Bridger, they met the Donner Party, which was kind of interesting. And I'm pretty sure everybody knows who the Donner Party is. They actually had a pretty difficult crossing and had to resort to cannibalism by the end of that. So that was kind of a turning point for everybody at that meeting point, because there was a proposal to take the Hastings cutoff, which the Donner Party decided to do. They decided to take that route. And it was being encouraged because the Mexican-American War was happening at that time. And they really wanted to get as many of the settlers out there to help fight that war as they could. However, the Hastings route was not very tried. It had not been traversed very often. And so it was a risky thing. And the young men of the Donner Party wanted to take that route. And there was so many, children and younger families along the way. They felt that they couldn't afford to lose their younger men, and so they all stuck together and tried to do this trip. Margaret Hecox actually notes that they seemed somewhat disorganized when she was observing them, and they tended to argue amongst themselves quite a bit. So that might have also kind of, led to some of their problems. The Emus Party, however, had an excellent guide at that point. Caleb Greenwood was his name. He was a mountain man, and he had led quite a few caravans across the way. There hadn't been many at that time, but he had led a couple previous to them, and he was very successful and well respected. However, he got intercepted around Fort Hall and asked to come home because his wife was sick. So he had to leave them, and it left the Emus Party without a leader, without a guide to show them how to move through there. And you can kind of see here, you can see the different Indian tribes that they encountered along the way. Margaret Hecox actually really documented a lot of their experiences, which were quite interesting, and how they interacted with the different tribes. They did a lot of trading. They really tried to, be peaceful and give gifts as much as possible and be respectful as they crossed through the different Indian nations. And so they were pretty successful in that sense. And then along the way, fortunately for them, they met up with Chief Truckee. So Chief Truckee had actually led Fremont. John Fremont previously, Truckee had guided him and his group over the mountains, over the Sierras. So Chief Truckee was interested in, kind of making peace with the settlers, and he offered to guide them. And so Chief Truckee was well respected. He was a Northern Paiute. He was considered a spiritual leader and a medicine chief. And so he had a lot of respect from his own people, and he learned to speak fairly good English. So he was able to communicate pretty well with everybody. And he became a good friend of the Hecoxes, because later on in their memoirs, he was mentioned several times, and I believe Chief Truckee came to Santa Cruz and actually lived in this area for a few years when he was older. And it's my idea that he is actually the one who kind of planted the seed of coming to Santa Cruz with the Emus Party, because it ended up quite a few of them settled in this area, and it hadn't really been the mission of this caravan ahead of time, but it seems during the route out there, they had kind of decided that this was a good location. And I think Truckee had a lot to do with it. Santa Cruz was very much on the trading route. It had been on the trading route for the Native Americans for thousands of years. They had, very far inland, you would find abalone and cinnabar that all came from this area, from our area here. So, and we even have a place here called the Poganip, which is a Paiute name, which means the place of fog. So I do believe that Truckee did have some sort of connection previous to the Hecoxes and the other people from the Emus Party moving out to this area. But anyways, he got them across the mountains safely. And they arrived at Sutter's Fort 6 months after they left on October 1st. And anybody who comes to the valley, the Sacramento Valley at that time of year knows it's not the most beautiful time of year to come to California. We haven't had rain for over 6 months, and it's dried up and it looks pretty parched. The land looks parched. And when the rest of the caravan was celebrating, Margaret Hecox crawled to the back of her wagon, and she buried her head and just cried because she couldn't believe that they had gone all this way to come, left their beautiful fields in Illinois, their green pastures, to come to this desolate, forsaken area. So she was not impressed with California when she first arrived. However, Sutter was very welcoming, but immediately when they came to the valley, they were intercepted by soldiers who wanted the men to come join the Mexican-American War. And this was probably the only time that Margaret Hecox was glad that her husband was so sickly. He had suffered, even before they had left Illinois, he had been working in a lead mine, and he suffered a lot of asthma and lung issues. And so that was one of the reasons they had decided to come west, is because of, the promised golden land where the weather was always fine. And so at that point, he was pretty sickly when they had finally gotten over the mountains. And it's quite often that Margaret Hecox had to drive the wagon. She was the one who would step up when Edna Hecox was not feeling well and kind of fill in for him. And so he stayed along with many of the women and children, and there was a few other men, and they were told to go on to the Santa Clara mission and hole up there in a fortress. John Sutter was very taken with Margaret Hecox because she could speak German. She was from a German family. And as you'll see along the way, Margaret Hecox has quite a way with learning languages. So she was able to speak with Sutter in German, and he was very taken by her and gave her a lot of extra supplies for their family, which they ended up sharing with the rest of their party as they continued to move west. So they went and they stayed in Santa Clara for the duration of the Mexican-American War, which was another about 4 or 5 months. And the Santa Clara mission had been pretty much, it was a ruin by the time that they got there. And it had been a stable. It was full of fleas, and there was holes in the roof and all over the walls. So they had to really, take this area and kind of create a fortress out of it to protect them. And the Spanish Mexican people that were there were pretty hostile towards them. because of course they were at war and they didn't want to sell them food. They saw the white settlers as traitors. And so they really had to kind of fend for themselves. They did survive thanks to the generosity of some of the people. And there was one woman in particular that helped them survive this very difficult time. And I write about her in the book. She was quite an interesting character. And so during this time also in Santa Clara, quite a few of the people died of typhoid fever because it was a very dark, gloomy place. The water was not clean. And so the Hecox family was fortunate to survive that. And they eventually were able to leave in March of the next year. And they moved to SoCal, California, which is just south here of Santa Cruz. Right now you're looking at pictures of early Santa Cruz. But before these pictures were taken, the Hecox family lived in SoCal on the property of Martina Castro. Martina Castro was one of the wealthiest women in California because of the enormous land grant that she held. And Adna Hecox took a job repairing their sawmill because the redwoods were becoming very much in demand. The Spanish Mexican people had not been using much wood and hadn't been using the forest. They had primarily been using the land for cattle ranching and for sending the hides all around the world for their leather. But with the settlers coming out to the west, redwood was becoming more and more in demand. So he took a job doing that. But at that time, just about a year later, the gold rush hit. And so many of the men left for the gold fields, and that includes Adna Hecox. He actually went out and joined the gold fever rush as well. And he got Margaret Hecox settled in Santa Cruz. He bought a piece of property. He was able to make enough money working at the mill that he was able to establish, a place in Santa Cruz for her to stay. It was a little bit safer and closer to somewhat what you would call civilization. And so here's just a picture of early Santa Cruz. And Adna Hecox was actually part of, you can maybe see here in the corner, there's a wharf that comes out here. It's called the Old Potato Wharf. So him and his business partner built this wharf. It was the first wharf built in the Santa Cruz Harbor, so that the ships, before the ships would have to be loaded by people carrying the goods out to the rowboats, and then the rowboats taking them out to the ships. So that was the first wharf here. Adna Hecox kind of created a nice little farm with some orchards, and that was primarily how he was making his living. He was also a carpenter, and they created a little boarding house as well. So they had several ways of having their income. And this potato wharf was for them to get him and his partner, Elihu Anthony, to get their goods out to the ships so that they could be shipped, into other places. And so life was good, and Adna Hecox's career went on, and he served many positions throughout California. But in 1869, they decided to build a lighthouse here in Santa Cruz. So this is the Monterey Bay here. Down here is where the oldest lighthouse was built, and that was probably back in 1855 that was built. That's the one of the oldest lighthouses on the California coast. And Santa Cruz was the 12th lighthouse built. And the Monterey Bay, for those who don't know much about the Monterey Bay, it's been compared to, or it's been called the Serengeti of the sea. And what makes this area so special, to this day, I mean, during this day, there's a tremendous amount of researchers, labs, and stuff like that, because between Santa Cruz and Monterey, we've got the deepest, it's called the Monterey Bay Submarine Canyon. And it's kind of the Grand Canyon of the ocean. It goes about a mile deep. And so you've got this very, very deep water habitat, like right in the center, so close to land. So just in this area here, from here to here, there's a vast amount of animals, and this is a protected area now too. This is a reserve. It's protected all the way from San Francisco all the way down to Big Sur. This is a protected area, and it's just really full of wildlife. So you can see here, this is what our main characters look like back at the kind of the time of the opening of the lighthouse. Adna Hecox, because he could read, he first served as the alcalde. That was before California was even part of the United States. So he was kind of the mayor of Santa Cruz, and then he became the justice of the peace. He then served as the public administrator and the treasurer. Finally, the judge, and until his death, a lot of times people called him Judge Hecox. So he was pretty beloved as a judge, and he was considered a very fair judge. He always kind of stood on the side, even of the meek and the people who usually didn't fare well in these sort of lawsuits with like the Mexican land grants and the Native Americans. So he was considered a very just judge, and he finally took the post of lighthouse keeper. And through all this time, he's also a minister for the Methodist Church, and he established one of the first Methodist church along with his friend, Mr. Anthony. They established the first Methodist church in Santa Cruz, and they also formed the Temperance Party of Santa Cruz too. So he had a pretty rough life when he was a sailor and a soldier in his younger days. It said that he had a scar across his chin because he'd been in a fight. So he had a very different life, and he was a very different person. After he met his wife, he became an educated gentleman. And if you could read back in those days in the Wild West, that made you a pretty prominent citizen. And so he was given a lot of responsibility, and I believe that he deserved that responsibility. He was a pretty noble person, it seems. And Margaret Hecox was very well known for her wisdom, and she could speak Spanish fluently, and she could communicate with the different people. She had a lot of knowledge in taking care with using different herbs, caring medically for people. They didn't have many doctors back at that time, so she helped deliver babies. She helped, take care of the people there in the area. And then this is Laura Hecox. She was about 15 years old when her father became Lighthouse. And from the very beginning, she was pretty much the assistant lighthouse keeper. She was the second youngest, and most of her brothers and sisters were already grown at that time. Her older brother, Adney Hecox Jr., he was interested in horses and training trotting horses in particular, and he had no interest in staying around the lighthouse. For the most part, it was a fairly boring job to be at the lighthouse 24 hours a day. And so Laura was her father's assistant, and she really loved the job. Her and her father had oftentimes, wandered the coast together. And from the very beginning, even before Laura went to live at the lighthouse, she was a collector. She had already collected, different specimens. She liked shells, and growing up at the ocean side, of course, most kids here do have a little collection of shells or things that they found at the ocean. Laura Hecox did experience a terrible accident when she was a child, and there's not a lot of information about what exactly happened to Laura, but she was paralyzed on one half of her body. And it seems that she sort of overcame this throughout her life, but she was always somewhat impaired. So people who met her always expressed sympathy, that she was such a wonderful, sweet person, but she suffered from this sort of handicap, but it's not really clear exactly what it is. If you look at any of the pictures of Laura, she doesn't have a cane or crutches or anything, so she seems able to walk all right, but it was something that was noticeable. And it may be the reason that Laura did not go to school with the rest of the children, is because that she was, you know, kind of considered somewhat different. She seemed that she was a very precocious child. You know, she was reading, you know, pretty large books and newspapers at a young age. And and her mother was kind of a teacher. Her mother was quite busy, but Laura was a very, you know, curious child, and she had always been interested in many different things. So Laura was, for the most part, pretty self-educated. Anyways, this is a picture of the lighthouse. It's not a sensational lighthouse. You can see that it's not very tall. It's, you know, it's only, altogether, the lighthouse on top of the cliff is only about 70 feet. You know, the light is up here about 70 feet, but if it was too much higher, it would be difficult to see. And it was really established as a harbor light. The Point Pinos lighthouse was much more important. That area had been considered the graveyard of ships because there had been so many wrecks there, and it was much rockier. But the lighthouse point was more just a welcoming kind of harbor light. It would show the entranceway for, you know, people that, and we oftentimes do have, you know, are fogged in. And so this light was not very high. And you can kind of see how small the lighthouse actually was. And even though at that time there was only, you know, Laura Hecox, her younger brother, and her mother and father living there full time, they often had visitors. And there's so many, you know, kind of, we get you know, a lot of testimony from people who had stayed there about incidences that happened. They are the ones who kind of recorded some of the history much better than the Hecoxes themselves. Unfortunately, the lighthouse logbooks are lost to history. We don't have those logbooks, which can really, you know, give a lot of information. We didn't really have that much to go by from the day-to-day life, except what other people wrote about while they were staying at the Hecox Lighthouse. And it's just hard to imagine that they had so many visitors, but they had many, many friends, you know, friends from different, you know, they were traveling ministers oftentimes, sea captains would stay there, and of course, family members. So there was lots of nephews and nieces and, you know, cousins that would come visit them. So they usually had a full house. And of course, the Hecoxes had many grandchildren that liked to come visit, especially during the summer. They had a full house because many of the family members would return with their families back to the lighthouse and spend their summers there. And here's just a close-up of the watch room and the lantern room here. So it was pretty small. This is probably just like 6 or 7 feet across. It's a 5th order Fresnel lens, which, you know, is fairly small, especially compared to the Point Pinos one. But they did a great job. They kept it impeccable. And in all the years that the Hecox family was tending the lighthouse, they never ever let the lighthouse or the light go out. So you can see here it was accessed through a very narrow trap door in the floor, and they had to climb a ladder. So it really seems to me Laura's handicap couldn't have been really so incapacitating, because she was able to get up and down this ladder quite easily and many times throughout the day. This is one of a picture of the lighthouse, you know, soon after it was built. I call this the disappearing horse photograph. Here you can see probably the horse was moving as the photograph was being taken, but this kind of shows the way that the lighthouse first looked originally out there. And this was one of the many tenders that came. The tenders came quarterly, and you know, they would deliver, you know, supplies. You know, the lighthouse, the Santa Cruz lighthouse, was actually a pretty easy position to take. It was a pretty desirable appointment because it was so close to town. It was just about a mile out of town. So it was easy walking distance. They could get a lot of their goods there. You didn't make a lot of money as a lighthouse keeper. So they had some, supplies delivered, but this boat was mostly, the boat. And this was one of the later tenders, the Sequoia, but the one before this was the Manzanita. There was a couple before that. They would, bring some supplies, things to, repair the lighthouse. They would bring their paycheck quarterly, and they would also do the quarterly inspections. And the Santa Cruz Lighthouse always got top recommendations during the inspections. It was considered a healthful place to live. They actually had quite a large garden. It was about 100 feet by 200-foot vegetable garden that they kept. They had a horse, they had a cow. So they were pretty, self-sufficient and could really maintain their lives pretty well. And they didn't have their own pier or wharf or anything. So every time the ship came, they had to go into the harbor, and then they would bring, the supplies up by wagon and deliver it up to the lighthouse there. And during the history of the lighthouse, there wasn't much excitement. There was the wreck of the Active in 1870. It was a big loss to the company. This was one of the little schooners who would deliver. This particular one was delivering railroad ties, so it was pretty heavily loaded. And it happened in the middle of the night that they lost the wind, and the schooner was just really left to the waves and got pushed into the sand, into a steep cove where they could not escape the boat. So what the Hecox family did, there was actually quite a few people staying there at that time. The family threw a heavy weight to the boat after many attempts and tied it off to the top. And the men had to come hand over hand up the cliff, and then they would be pulled up. And so there was about, I believe about 14 sailors that had to be rescued here, coming hand over hand and finally getting ashore. And finally, the schooner was pushed completely, onto the sand and kind of left there. And so the company that owned the ship, kind of took everything that was of any value, and then it was sort of just left there. And for the longest time, a lot of the grandchildren and the kids who would come to stay at the Hecox house would talk about coming to play out on the wreck, because when the tide was out, they could, kind of climb up on the hull here, and it became sort of a adventurous, kind of toy for them. And the other thing that happened, and this was after Laura's father died, the earthquake, on April 18th of 1906, at 5 a.m., there was an earthquake, and the lighthouse withstood that fairly well. However, the chimney broke and shattered into little tiny pieces. So Laura Hecox got up there and kept the light burning until sunrise. And then she was able to replace the chimney. So she saved the day on that occurrence. But those were really the only two, kind of note incidences in that long time, which was probably a good thing for Laura, since and the Hecoxes, since they enjoyed, just the wonderful, relaxed life they had. Of course, there was a lot of work in keeping up a lighthouse, right along the ocean there. They had to do lots of repair work and then, of that nature. But for the most part, it was a pretty easy assignment. Dr. Charles Anderson became a friend of the family, and especially a very good friend of Laura Hecox's. And I'm not quite sure if he met them because of Laura's handicap through Laura, but he had a huge influence on Laura. Charles Anderson was not just a physician, but he wrote many articles about the geography or the geology of Santa Cruz. He was especially interested in the botany. He documented many plants and of the birds, and he was a big part of the conservation movement, especially towards the end of his life, to save the redwood trees. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, and that's in the later part of my book. But he's a main character throughout this book, and it was him that gave Laura her first, shell guide that she could use. And I believe it really opened Laura's door, Laura's mind to kind of scientific thinking and investigative kind of thinking. And so he comes up a lot in the story. Laura loved to go out and explore during the tides. And this is a picture of, this is just up the coast. Laura, wandered up and down the coast. She had time during the day to do this. This is a little bit further up. This is closer to Davenport, a few miles out of Santa Cruz to the north. This was New Year's, or no, this is actually Christmas Eve. We had a king tide here. And for anybody who loves the tides, king tide's a big deal because we get to go really out to this water world that's normally completely inaccessible to humans. And so I know Laura Hecox was very excited at this time of year because she's got specimens to show that she was really exploring this deeper tidal water here. And so this is just kind of gives you, those of you who haven't really experienced the Santa Cruz tides, you can kind of see. So Laura was really serious about collecting shells. She especially loved shells. She was considered a conchologist specialist at the end of her life. And as Jeremy mentioned, she had a couple of specimens named after her because, she was really, bringing them to these different shells and specimens to the attention of scientists all across the country. This was still a pretty unexplored area. And Laura Hecox's research really filled in a lot of, questions for scientists. And so she sent specimens all across the country. She communicated even with the head of the Smithsonian, who was the mollusk specialist out there. And another person who actually named one of the specimens after her was in Ohio, working at the university there. So she really, not just served her own collection, but, many more famous collectors and scientists who were really doing work that was, being published and out there. So because of Laura, I think that they really, they had a good head start on this sort of, new environment. Here you can see a limpet. These are gooseneck barnacles and mussels here. I can kind of see just the whole variety. So, Laura had a tremendous collection of all these different types of shells. And so what they decided to do, her and her father, is decided to create a museum using Laura's collections. And this is actually a case, he was a carpenter, that he made for her. I don't know if it was the first one, but he actually ended up making several for her. It's made out of rosewood and very special. You can see how it's full of different specimens. And she didn't just have shells, she had all sorts of art, she had artifacts from the Native Americans from the area and from all around, because they were on the Pacific Ocean. They were on a trading route. So they had, she had artifacts from way up, way up north, and from the Tlingit people up there, and the Aleutians, and then from way down south, and from Hawaii, and from all over the Pacific Rim. I believe many people brought her gifts. The more renowned her museum became, the more kind of gifts she got, and they came from all over the place. And the museum became, more and more important. The Lighthouse became really like a tourist destination, and they were required to be open 3 days a week for public inspection. And so Laura, that was her job during this time, is to take people on tours through the Lighthouse. So she would begin, first of all, by dusting them with the big feather duster. And because she felt very strongly about not having one speck of dust near the lantern. And so everybody got dusted as they entered. And then she would take groups of about 6 or 7 people up, first to the watch room, where so-called they could keep an eye on the lantern. And then they would climb up that small little ladder up into the lantern room. And it was a very small space, but then she would very respectfully and with devotion show her love of the lantern up there, the light, and how it magnifies. She would put her hand in there and kind of show people how it magnified. And so that was really the love of her life. The focus of her life is taking care of that light, keeping it clean and keeping it burning. And so after that, then she would bring her guests down into the living quarters, and one room of that tiny little house was completely devoted to Laura's collection. So imagine that, kind of in the middle of your living room, and people coming there 3 times a week, coming in and out. They did keep a register of all the guests that would come through. They had to sign their names when they come through. And, throughout each year, they had about 1,300 to 1,500 visitors throughout the year. So that was quite a few visitors that came through and got to see Laura's collection. And I really believe Laura was very interested in really, introducing people to the species and getting, kind of building up their appreciation for the wildlife and for the nature of that area. In her time, she saw so many changes in Santa Cruz. One of the exciting things about having the lighthouse at the harbor meant that, Santa Cruz was becoming a very important seaport. It was going to be, on the map. So they were, logging the redwoods, and they were, creating lime, kind of, blowing up the mountains for the lime to be, sent to San Francisco and to Los Angeles, and to all the big cities to cement together these big cities. They were actually exporting tanned hides and also papers. So they had a lot of industry, but that was also extremely hard on the environment. And Laura was paying attention. She was, collecting land specimens and as well as sea specimens. And so she was really seeing, kind of the deterioration before her very eyes, and very quickly. So for her, it was really important to really introduce people and to educate them about all the different, animals and plants that lived in that area. And one of the ways, I created an exhibit for our library. And this is where these scrapbooks are Laura's scrapbooks. These are one of the items that we do have from Laura that tells us a lot about her. They don't have much writing from her. A lot of them are dated, but it tells you everything about what interested Laura. So what she pretty much did is clip newspaper articles. And these are newspaper articles from all over, not just San Francisco and Santa Cruz, but from all over. And you can see to the side here, I list all of the different things that you would find inside these scrapbooks. There's 5 of them all together. The images that I'm going to show you are pretty much just from one of them. The one that's probably the most interesting, and you can find that on the Santa Cruz Natural History Museums. You can find that on their website. They actually have documented this particular scrapbook. And so I spent a lot of times with these scrapbooks, and it was nice to do it at the library because we didn't have to remove this exhibit from the library, and the museum was kind enough to lend some specimens. So we were able to put together a pretty nice exhibit all together here. And so this is just some kind of a look inside the book here. And this is some articles, of course, about in the invertebrate and the mollusks in this area. This particular article is very interesting. There was the Colonel Lamson put together a whole collection of specimens. This is a train, and it's headed for Chicago for the Chicago Fair. And so they took these specimens in the salt water, kept the pumps circulating the water, and transported these specimens all the way out to be seen in Chicago. And so that was pretty interesting to introduce the rest of the world, that they could really physically kind of see some of these interesting, kind of specimens that had never been seen anywhere else before. And so here's some other articles that she has in there. I didn't show all of them, of course, but these are just some of the ones that stood out. And she had some of her own articles in there too. I'm just going to read you real quickly, just so you can kind of get a tone of her voice. This is the article she wrote on chitons. There are notes from the shell gathering, from notes of shell gathering at Santa Cruz. I will begin with the multi-valve shells. They are composed of 8 pieces or separate valves placed in a longitudinal series, being joined to each other by inserted lamina named articulata. The genus chiton is the only example of multi-valves that is true mollusca. The animals are somewhat like a limpet in shape, and then cling to the rock by a broad, flat foot. Take and separate the valves of some of these species, and they look very much like butterflies. We have here, according to Dr. J.G. Cooper, 16 species, but I only have 10 in my cabinet. And then the one you see over here, this is described over here in this article, in this paragraph. Mopalia mucosa is common all along the west coast of the United States. It is found quite plentiful here. A person would walk over them time after time and would never think to look for them where they live. They live in little depressions in the rocks, and the sea anemones cover them over so they cannot be seen. Outside, its color is dark, and it is sometimes covered with seaweed, but within, the valves are beautiful light green, length 2 inches. So this is kind of how she, educates and informs people. She's also known to have one of the best kind of displays at the Santa Cruz Fair each year. She would bring examples of the bird specimens, of her shells, and all sorts of different things, and create a very colorful display of the natural kind of history of Santa Cruz. And so she was written up quite a few times about that in the newspapers. And here's on some of the animal species around, and the seaside, the Hopkins Seaside Laboratory, of course, was great interest to her. She really followed the opening of the Natural History Museum up in the city. And she had a lot of artifacts too. So she was really following what was happening with the Native Americans. A lot of her articles are about that. And this is in particular are some articles just on baskets, just on the basket weaving, which for the people who lived here, the Ohlone people here in the Santa Cruz area, basket making was how they would carry even their water, how they would cook. Their baskets were so tightly woven, they were able to contain water. So it was a real art form, but it was extremely laborious, and it took a lot of really special materials. These grasses and reeds that they were using were disappearing quite quickly. And so it's pretty impossible to find an old Indian basket. I think the biggest collection is held in Russia of the Ohlone baskets. We don't have hardly any here to really show as examples, which is really a shame. It's kind of a lost history for us. Fortunately, Laura was able to, keep some of the other. She had a lot of, mortar and pestle kind of things and different implements, used by the native people here. So thanks to her collection, we were able to keep some of those. Another thing that you would find in her collection were articles about women. She clipped a lot of articles, not about just about, movie stars, or not movie stars, but famous celebrities. But these were scientists, they were writers, Native American women who were important. This particular woman was the sister of her first landlord, Martina Castro. This was Marina de Los Angeles, who she brought her and her father, Adna Hecox, bought his first piece of property from Maria de Los Angeles and her husband, Joseph Majors. So ended up being her family's second landlord out here. And unfortunately, Maria de Los Angeles lost most of her possessions in her lifetime. And Martina Castro also had a pretty sad ending to her story, which was kind of, unfortunately, the story of many of the women. Let me just go back to that last, or unfortunately, the story of many of the Mexican landholders. They had lost pretty much all of their land. And of course, the Native Americans lost out very early and had already been fairly devastated by the missionaries that had come here in the first place. So this is probably the most interesting article here in this corner. This is her sister who went by the writer's name of Marie Velasquez. And this is Georgiana Bruce Kirby over here in this corner. And this is Eliza Farnham. And the article here is about the Santa Cruz intellectuals. And these women in particular were interested in women's rights. Georgiana Bruce Kirby was really key to creating Santa Cruz into kind of the suffrage hotbed. She was an educator, she was a writer, she was friends with many famous people, part of the transcendentalist kind of movement on the East Coast, and she came west with her friend Eliza Farnham, or because of her friend Eliza Farnham. Oops, sorry about that. And she had a big influence on Catherine. That was Maria Velasquez, that's her alias or whatever, but that was Laura's older sister. And Laura's sister Catherine became very involved in the suffrage movement, a very vocal, vocal activist. And Georgiana Bruce Kirby invited many speakers to come out, and she was friends with Elizabeth Canton, Susan B. Anthony, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and many other women's suffrage. And she would write articles and really petition the state to have the woman's vote. And unfortunately, in her lifetime and in Laura's lifetime, they were unsuccessful. But Laura clipped all these articles, and in her own way, she really supported this movement. She herself was, a professional woman making her way in the world without, without a man, and really, also believed that she deserved, especially serving, the country. She deserved, to be taken as a voting citizen. Douglas Tilton is Laura's nephew and the son of Catherine, her older sister. And Douglas Tilton becomes he becomes deaf when through a fever when he's quite young. And he was sent as a child to the California School of the Deaf. And one of the big philosophies of this School of the Deaf was that they would teach art because they felt visuals were so important for the deaf students. And this was a really wonderful school. Catherine, his mother, sat on the board, was part of the board of the School for the Deaf. And they really created a wonderful environment for the kids. And these are some of Douglas Tilton's sculptures that are still existing today. This one is actually at the School of the Deaf was originally established in San Francisco. Then it was built in a much grander scale in Berkeley, California. And then now today it's in Fremont. And this statue, the bear hunt, is still in Fremont. And this particular sculpture over here is actually, that is near Market Street in San Francisco. So that's still part of our cityscape. And if you can see, they're very classical. He studied in Paris for a while. He lived there. And one of his teachers, Theophilus Hope d'Estrella, who becomes a major character in Laura's books, was his teacher. He wasn't that much older than Douglas, but they became extremely good friends. And Theo was really a kind of a kindred spirit to Laura Hecox. They became very close, and he was very much interested in the natural world. He was deaf and he was mute, so he expressed himself with his fingers, and Laura and her mother could read sign language and they could speak sign language. So they were, easily able to communicate. And oftentimes Douglas and Theo would bring other students from the deaf school during vacation, summer vacations or winter vacations. So they spent quite a bit of time at the Lighthouse, and he was really well known for his photography. What he would do is he would create slides, and this is kind of a precursor to the movies. I don't know if anybody knows what the magic lanterns are, but what they would do is they would take slides and project them life-size onto the walls and create these kind of magic lantern shows. So this was before the movies, and he felt that this was a great way to educate the children. So he would use his own slides, his own photographs, and he also would use photographs that he would buy. And so, he created this wonderful education for the students. And he was part of the Sierra Club. He met John Muir on several occasions and hiked with him into Yosemite and into the wild there. And so, anyways, he became a really important part. This was another image from Edward Muybridge, and Theo assisted him as he was taking these photographs. And this shows the California School of the Deaf there. And he also took these pictures of Laura. So these are at the Natural History Museum. They're part of an album that he gave to Laura. And so these are pretty valuable. This isn't a very high quality collection here, but all of these pictures were done by Theo. Here's Laura with her mother on several occasions, Laura, and that famous picture of her collecting, and she's underneath that natural bridge that we saw out there. And I don't think he took that picture, but he did take this picture here. And so that's just some friends out there visiting the lighthouse. And so now we're getting towards the end. Laura became somewhat famous in her lifetime, not as famous as some of the lighthouse keepers. She was an assistant for 13 years and the lighthouse keeper for 33 years. So that was a long, almost 50 years of serving the lighthouse. So here's an article that describes Laura. And that one of the interesting things that the writer, the reporter talked about was how Laura didn't leave any chance up to when the sun was going to rise or when it was going to set. So she would consult her charts each day, and she would use the sunset equation, the sunrise equation, to really figure out exactly when the sun was to rise and to set on Point Santa Cruz Lighthouse. So that's kind of the just to show you her fastidiousness, how exact she liked to be, how precise she loved. She really loved science. She loved math. These were things that really, were important to her. And finally, Dr. Anderson convinced Laura her collection was becoming so large and it was very important, and he thought it deserved to be, really properly displayed with electric lights and, in a safe location. So he convinced her to donate her collection to the city. So she donated her collection in 1904, and it was finally, the display cases were built, ready to go, finally in 1905. So here we have, this is above is the library, the Carnegie Library that Dr. Anderson sat on the board of, and down here was where Laura's collection is, down underneath, and that's where the museum was. And it was really Laura's collection to begin with, but now it was going to be large enough to, be able to add to that. Eventually, a couple years after that, Margaret Hecox passed away, but she had lived at the lighthouse with Laura throughout these years. And I really think it enabled Laura, because she did a lot of the domestic chores, it enabled Laura to really be able to go out and to do her research, really, studying these tide pools. Laura was a very, thorough researcher, and she kept notes, and she would go back to the same habitats time and time again to really investigate. And so this is just part of the eulogy that Theophilus Hope d'Estrella wrote about her. I think he knows her pretty well. And I think that that description at the end really describes the Hecox family, that they were welcoming and generous to everybody that they met. So I admire that a lot, because in those days, in the later days of Santa Cruz's history, there was a lot of discrimination. First, it was against the Native Americans, and in a very, extreme, violent way, really towards extermination. And there was a very extreme anti-Chinese sentiment, and the Hecoxes really stayed above that fray, and they really always kind of maintained this open door to everybody. This is Laura when right before she resigned. She resigned at the age of 62, and I just love this noble picture of Laura. And yeah, so that's the end and of my presentation. And I think there's a little bit more to offer. I just want to say Laura really never left the Lighthouse area throughout her life, but she really, the world came to her doorstep, not just through the ocean. The ocean, of course, would bring its gifts each day to the seashore. And she would, find all these wonderful things in the tide pools. And she had these newspaper collections. I think that she really, really understood and tried to understand a great deal about the world. And so for not having to really traveled much, she was very, intelligent, and really understood her place and the importance of nature in the environment. And I think she really wanted to share that, especially with children. And that's the idea behind sharing her collection at the end with the museum. And that's where Laura and I, we kind of come together and sharing our love of nature with children. And so I really am glad that I had Laura as an example to use for this kind of mission of teaching kids about their cultural and natural, place in this world.
Thank you so much, Lynn. Absolutely fascinating. At this point, if you want to come out of screen sharing, Lynn, you can click stop sharing at the top of there you go. All right, so we've been getting some questions in the chat, and we'll get to those in a couple of moments. But you just mentioned the museum again, and at this point, I am going to play a video. Lynn, you and I asked Kathleen Aston, the collections manager of the museum, if she could take part in this event today. She was not able to do that, but she did a little Zoom meeting with me yesterday, and we recorded a short video for this. Let me just tell you, everybody, the Santa Cruz Museum of Natural History, which has been referred to a number of times already, is also affectionately known by locals as the Whale Museum. It is one of the earliest museums in the state of California. And of course, it is founded based on the Laura Hecox collection. The museum's collections grew extensively through the years, acquiring many Native American and archaeological artifacts, as well as natural history specimens. It's housed in a Carnegie library named after the Carnegie Philanthropic Foundation that founded the construction of the library in 1915. So, excuse me, Kathleen Aston is the collections manager for the museum. Again, she couldn't join us today, but she recorded this video. I'm going to go ahead and play it.
Thank you, Jeremy, for introducing me. I'm Kathleen. I'm the collections manager at the Santa Cruz Museum of Natural History. I'm sorry that I'm not able to attend this event in the moment, but I greatly look forward to the recording. I love the Lighthouse Society. I use your guys' archive fairly often to look things up. It's a great resource if folks in the audience don't yet know about that. And I just wanted to talk a little bit today about how we at the museum relate to Laura's legacy. I think Lynn's work is a great example of how Laura's story can mean so much to so many folks. And I think that we're just especially grateful that as an institution, this is our foundational origin story. So Laura Hecox's collection is the foundation of our collections. And one of those really important pieces of that is this cabinet that you're looking at here in this picture. So this cabinet is on display in the museum's main galleries. It has been for years, but we recently remodeled the museum to sort of, reinforce how important this particular cabinet is. And I'll show some pictures of that in a couple of slides. In this next slide, you can see just an example of different kinds of cabinets that have me thinking about the different sorts of ways we engage with natural history on display and how Laura was thinking and engaging with natural history on display. So I mentioned that we're so glad that we have this cabinet, and anything that we have of Laura, we're so grateful for, because some parts of her collection have been lost to time. And while we have catalog books, we don't have personal correspondence. We don't have diaries. We don't have these kinds of things that really give us an insight to like what was going on with her as a person, kind of more directly. But there are a set of scrapbooks that she made that are held in the collections of the Santa Cruz Public Library's local history collection, which I know Lynn has looked at and done research on, and which I've done a couple of projects on. And so on the far left, there's an image of a cabinet that Laura was interested in. She was always clipping articles on all sorts of things, ranging from women's suffrage events to poetry to archaeology, but definitely always natural history. And so I don't know if when she was clipping this article about this cabinet, if she was thinking about the cabinet design or just thinking about how maybe those folks were displaying those things, because all of these things really mattered to her. She was so passionate about the natural world, and also so passionate about not just understanding it personally, but also displaying it, sharing it, and talking to people about it. And so in the middle slide of the slide here, you have a picture, which you folks may have already seen in Lynn's presentation, of Laura's collection on display in the Lighthouse. So, the keepers were required to have public viewings of the Lighthouse, and Laura also incorporated her museum into that experience. It was a well-known tourist attraction. People thought it was really cool. And she had everything organized, everything labeled, and it took up a greater part of like the living space of the Lighthouse, what was supposed to be the home for the keeper and their family, but was also the home for the museum. These cabinets are beautiful, and I think emphasize just like her dedication to sharing those sorts of things. She would also, we have a couple examples of her like writing articles in like local newspapers to explain what different kinds of specimens were. We know that she was often taking parts of her collection or collections of friends of hers to local fairs and things like this. And so she was always trying to share stuff, even before she donated her collection to the city for the city's first public museum. And that includes on the right, the cabinet that I highlighted in the beginning, was a cabinet that she actually gave to her friend Theophilus de Estrella, who was a photographer and teacher at the California School for the Deaf, who was also really passionate about getting like people out into nature, making photographs of nature back to kids in his classrooms. And so she gave this cabinet to him to use as an educational tool at the school for many years. And we were very fortunate that after decades, in the early 90s, the California School for the Deaf was like, okay, this is a really cool thing. We don't really use it. Probably this museum wants it back, in a sense. So we never had it before, but we do feel like we've gotten it back and reincorporated into Laura's collection. And it's just an endless source of wonder for folks who come and visit the museum. We change the different drawers and we pull them out in different ways so people can see different types of specimens and different ways they were organized. And in 2016, and kind of recognizing the importance of this story of Laura, someone who didn't have formal training as a scientist, but was so passionate about the natural world, was able to learn things and move science forward through her personal just sense of care and her personal observations. We think this is a great example of how anyone can be a naturalist. And that is, a big part of what we do at the museum. And we're so grateful to be able to celebrate that legacy and carry it forward. And so in 2016, we kind of, took this cabinet and another exhibit that has been beloved of ours, this interactive touch pool, tide pool we've had for a couple decades. And we remodeled them to be our Santa Cruz naturalist exhibit. To explicitly call out this, amazing history of like folks in Santa Cruz, paying attention to, early, ways of observing nature during like this period of like the professionalization of science and this like particular way of knowing, We think it's really, we had a touch pool for a number of years that was kind of a little bit inaccessible. It was like really tall and uncomfortable to get to. And this redesign of the tide pool increases accessibility for folks with different abilities, for children, folks of different ages. And we think that's another important thing to think about in trying to, in wanting to make sure that we're honoring this legacy of anyone can be a naturalist. We think it's important to provide many different kinds of opportunities and different ways for different learning styles, different sort of priorities, different types of engagement to get people excited about nature, and to bring this kind of love for it that Laura had growing up at the Lighthouse, and find ways to connect that to people as they're growing up here in Santa Cruz, or living their lives as an adult too. And so people seem to really love this exhibit. I know it's a favorite of mine. And so I'll just end on a photo at an event of a family really enjoying one of these touch pools. And you can see it's a little bit blurred out, but you can see the photograph of Laura in the background. So yeah, I think I'll go ahead and end there. And again, I'm looking forward very much to hearing this presentation. And I guess, maybe one more thing that I'll end on is, so I'm the collections manager, and there's a lot of work we have to do in our museum, which is more than 100 years old, digitizing collections, making sure they're available and connected to the public. And I have been really honored to be able to provide access to more Laura Hecox related collection items to Lynn and others who are inspired by this story and interested in doing kind of research on local collections, to make different kinds of projects, to expand some story of this legacy into a novel, to do art projects. We have all kinds of ways that people are inspired and want to make something of this legacy that we have. And I'm so grateful that I'm able to share that with folks. And if you have any questions about any of this, feel free to email me. We are working on getting our collections online. That's a big part of what I do. And I'm really grateful for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. This is perfect. This is a wonderful addition to our event, and I really appreciate you doing this. And I was in Santa Cruz in 2015, and I've got to get back. I've got to visit your museum, but I visited the lighthouse that's there now, which is not exactly Laura's lighthouse, but there is a lighthouse at Point Santa Cruz there today.
They're not far apart. I recommend doing it as a pairing. You can go both to the Abbott Memorial Lighthouse and the Santa Cruz Surf Museum, which we also love, and you can come to ours on the same day.
Uh-huh. Excellent. Yeah. Oh, it sounds like a great idea. I really hope to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much again. I appreciate you taking part in this. Again, thanks to Kathleen for providing that little look at the museum and the important collection based on Laura Hecox's collection. So at this point, I think we've had a few questions in the chat. I'm gonna, Jeff, I don't know if you're seeing anything. If we scroll back a little bit, we can see.
Yep.
Yeah. Let's see. Go ahead. Go ahead, Jeff.
Lynn, what similarities do you see between Laura Hecox and other famous Lauras, like Laura Ingalls Wilder?
Well, probably, for me, that was pretty inspirational. I think a lot of women, especially my age range, grew up with Laura Ingalls Wilder and her, adventures, living in a Little House on the Prairie, Little House in the Big Woods. And so, of course, that's, kind of one of my foundational history lessons in life. My father was very interested in history too. So I've grown up going to a lot of Civil War battlefields. That was, but anyways, so I think the Little House in the Prairie, Laura Ingalls Wilder definitely was, I feel that there's a connection, but as far as Laura's go in general, I don't know if that has as much to do with it. Okay,
here's another one. Did Laura have a man helping her during her time working at the Lighthouse? a brother. This person, Mary, says it was often that she finds that women keepers had help. It was very physically demanding work. Do you know if she donned men's trousers when working?
Laura actually, if you look at the photographs of her, she was somewhat stylish. She would go out in a bustle and, a nice hat into the tide pools. And so she didn't really don trousers. I don't think she was really that kind of a woman. Georgiana Bruce Kirby, on the other hand, was known for wearing her bloomers while she was working on the roof of Eliza Farnham's house. But no, Laura actually really, her father was pretty sick towards the end of his life. And so she really took over most of his work. Towards the end of her tenure at the Lighthouse, her brother Adna, the horseman, he came back to live at the Lighthouse and he did help her. But it was really, Laura had held down that fort. She did a lot of the repairs. She did a lot of she carried the kerosene up and down the ladders, and even being somewhat handicapped. She was, she was 5'8". She wasn't a small woman, although in every article you read, they always say the little lighthouse keeper or whatever. It always feels a little derogatory to me because she was not really little at all. I think she was pretty, quiet and unassuming in a sense, but she did the heavy work and she knew how to do the heavy work and she was good at fixing things. So no, she didn't depend on a man whatsoever, actually.
Good. All right. Mercy wants to ask, what did she do after she resigned her lighthouse duty commission?
Well, she and her brother moved away from the lighthouse, and she lived in a kind of a small religious kind of camp a little bit south of the lighthouse. And I don't think she was that happy, although the day before she died, she went to visit the new lighthouse keeper at the lighthouse there. She had a visit. And then that next day, she actually had a stroke and she died. So she only lived 3 years after her tenure. And I think, it's a little bit of, a broken heart. She had spent most of her life right there, and it's really something. I mean, it's like taking maybe a fish out of water or, a turban snail out of its tide pool. And so that's just my feeling, but she did not live that much longer after her tenure.
Very interesting. Okay, so another question. And the original lighthouse isn't there, but what can somebody visit and experience with relation to your book if they were to visit the area? Is there actually any historic landmarks still available to tour?
Well, the tide pools are certainly still there. So I would definitely, take a look at the tide charts, check out low tide. There's several great places to access the ocean. And of course, the museum. I think that's one way to, kind of feel closer to Laura. And perhaps if you let them know you're coming and there's something special out of the collection you'd like to see, you can see a list of some of Laura's collection on the website, so you could even prepare ahead of time. They can take it out of the cellar or out of the archives there, and maybe Kathleen can show it to you. That's kind of fun. I could only ask for several specimens at a time, but I bugged Kathleen a lot. The more I learned, the more I wanted to see part of that that special collection. They of course, there was 2,000 specimens and artifacts that she donated, so you could never see all of those. And of course, just standing at the lighthouse, there's actually, I don't know if it's still visible after this winter, but you can see the cistern. There's a brick kind of round cistern that was just kind of hanging off the cliff. That's really the only part of the old lighthouse that's still there. Most of it that area has been completely eroded. You can still see the little island from the book where the sea lions still reside. One of the islands is gone, but one of the islands is still there, and it still has the sea lions out there barking.
So Barbara asks, so that ties into with this. So do you know what happened to the original lighthouse? Was it just destroyed by erosion, or was it taken down by the Coast Guard? Or
I think it was eventually taken out of, down by the Coast Guard. They didn't want to maintain it any longer. And, it would just be sort of a liability more than anything. And it wasn't really necessary anymore. There is still a light at the harbor, what is now the harbor. It's a different harbor. It's a little bit further south. And that harbor, there's a lighthouse there. It's not the original lighthouse, but that is actually more functional. The lighthouse that's there now, the Mark Abbott Memorial, does have a light that goes on each evening at sunset, and it shines all throughout the night. So,
well, luckily the Coast Guard has changed their tune about tearing down lighthouses. So that's a good progressive end to all this. They don't do that anymore, really. Last question on the chat, Jeremy, is I guess some people have been going back and forth. How do we order your book? Amazon, Lynn?
Yeah, I guess Amazon would be the best or easiest way. Our local bookstores are selling it here, and the museum, of course, is selling it. But it is on Amazon, and it's probably the quickest way to get it. Or I can send you a book if you contact me. So
somebody put on a link in the chat to the bookshop Santa Cruz. If you click on the link, it goes right to the. If people want to benefit that local bookstore, that might be nice to order it from them.
Yeah, we're very proud of our local bookstore.
Yeah. One thing I meant to do is to post, Kathleen Aston, who did the presentation for the museum, said people could email her if they have any questions. And I meant to get her email address to post in the chat. So I'm going to find that. Just give me a moment to do that. But, yeah, you mentioned the other lighthouse on the breakwater at Santa Cruz there, which I think is also known as the Walton Lighthouse, right, Lynn?
Right.
Yeah, and it's a modern, it's sort of a traditional looking lighthouse, but it was put there not that many years ago to replace a nondescript lighthouse on the breakwater. And I find it amusing that in some of the articles about Laura Hecox, you'll see a picture of that lighthouse, this modern lighthouse on the breakwater there, as if that's where she lived. But of course, it's not at all.
Well, and then there was a whistling buoy that was placed out there in the 1880s, and we still have our fog signals out there. So, that's probably the most important thing for our modern day mariners, is to hear the foghorn, because it does get very foggy here. Pretty much all of, most of June, we call it the June gloom. We're socked in with fog because it gets so hot inland. It really brings that coastal fog right to the coast here. So if you just go like a mile inland, you won't have any fog anymore. But we spend most of our summer in the fog here.
It's nice that you still have your foghorn. In many places in the United States, the foghorns have been decommissioned.
Yeah, well, we still have ours, and actually you can hear it, and from my house I can also hear the sea lions. So
nice.
Yeah, when the current's going right, I can hear everything that's happening out there.
Those sea lions can make so much noise. I remember in my West Coast trip a few years ago, in some places the sound of the sea lions echoing off buildings and stuff. They're incredibly loud.
And I really recommend this location for anybody who loves, I think there's probably a lot of nature lovers here. We have like 26 different mammal species. We've got bottlenose dolphins. Right now we're having the whales go by. We even have blue whales, the largest whales in the world, that come through here. So we have a pretty vast, diverse kind of wildlife here. And if you're going to come here, I'd also go to the Monterey Bay Sea Aquarium, where you can really see all these specimens really beautifully displayed. And
that's what I love about your book, Lynn, is it touches on all different aspects, not just lighthouses, the migration of the people in the United States, east to west, and the natural environment, and everything that's associated with lighthouse keeping, but generally isn't talked about. So I commend you on that. That's really, really a great way to put
Well,
it.
it was, this was really, a lot of migrants came through here, and, and out in the harbor, they would say that they would see, ships from Russia, from, China. There were flags from all over the world. And so, this really was, a meeting point. The world, really came, along the California coast. It was important. It was an important area. And we have the big mountain range that's behind us. So, when the railroad came, it took a while to get here, and really the harbor was the only way in and out of Santa Cruz, especially for our industries. And it was an important, and they were hoping it would even become more so, but at a certain point they tapped out all of our resources, and so not like else.
I just want to mention I posted Kathleen Aston's email at the Natural History Museum. I posted that in the chat if anybody has any questions for her, if you're planning to visit that museum or whatever. And somebody asked, Linda asked when I said the video would be available on YouTube, possibly tomorrow, but definitely by sometime Monday. Can't say exactly when, but within the next couple of days, it'll be posted on YouTube. Go to, again, search for USLHS on YouTube and you'll find the channel. Also eventually posted on the USLHS website itself. There's a video section on there as well. And I don't think there's any other questions. Jeff, am I missing anything? Well, somebody just asked Jane just asked at the end of the chat here, didn't they remove the whistling buoy from the harbor?
Yeah, the whistling buoy's gone. It was
Okay.
a basic, kind of mechanism, but we still do have, our foghorn.
Okay. So I don't think there's any other questions. So again, Lynn Guenther, thank you so much for doing this event today, and a lot of nice comments in the chat, people saying how much they enjoyed it. So as Jeff said, it covers so many aspects, not just lighthouses, but so many related aspects. So thank you so much, Lynn. And I also want to just mention again, I've mentioned the website already a few times, but uslhs.org, get on there. For those of you who maybe are new to the society, check out the website for information on tours, preservation grants, research catalog, the passport program, et cetera, all the things the society does. And please remember that all donations and memberships to the society help to support events like this, the podcasts, and all the preservation and education activities of the society. And watch for news of more of these Zoom events coming up. Jeff, I don't know if you have anything else you'd like to add?
No, that's great. Yeah, I think as Jeremy said, your donations help support Jeremy. Jeremy likes to work.
Yes.
Jeremy's great at what he does. Thank you,
He's
Jeremy.
great at what he does. Absolutely. Yep. We're lucky to have Jeremy for sure.
Well, back at you, Jeff. So, goes for you too. So thank you all so much, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, and I'll see some of you on the Long Island tour in May, and we'll see you again on Zoom coming up fairly soon. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.